Now, with all that, we're pretty much done with that big sign-up form. Of course, you can play around more with that form and try to add more features. But here for me, I just want to add two last features to that form. And the first feature is one we already worked with before. I want to show some error message if the user submits an invalid form, and I want to make sure that we don't continue in our TypeScript code here in onSubmit if an invalid form has been submitted. And I'll start with that actually. Here in onSubmit, we can check if this form invalid, which will be true if at least one of all the controls in the entire form is invalid. So if the form is invalid, then I want to return so that this code doesn't execute. And here I'll console log invalid form. That's the first step. With that, if we save that, if I reload, if I try to submit this empty form, I get invalid form. But I now also want to show an error message, let's say here or below these buttons, wherever you want. And for that, I'll now go to the signup component HTML file. And here at the very bottom, I'll add a paragraph with a class of control error, where I'll say invalid form data, please check your input data. Or maybe just invalid form, please check your input data. And I want to output this conditionally if my form is invalid, like this. Of course, we could be much more granular and output different error messages, also in different places, maybe right below the input to which they belong, for individual inputs, so that we give the user a more granular feedback regarding what's wrong, because this, of course, is a pretty generic and general message. Nonetheless, here, you'll see if I reload, this message shows up. Actually, right from the start, which is, of course, not what I want. Therefore, I'll enhance this and check if form is dirty and form was touched. So the user did interact with it. Now, if I save this, initially I don't see the message, but if I then tap into an input field, enter something, and then remove that so that it's invalid, I see that message. And actually, I'll get rid of that dirty check and just show that error as soon as the form was touched and is invalid. With that, it's enough to tap in there and out of there to see that error message. So that's what I'll do here. But as mentioned, you could definitely also output more granular, control-specific error messages. I'll not do that here though, to save some time, because I instead now wanna finally show you how you can create a validator that actually checks two controls at the same time, and in this case, makes sure that we have the same value in both controls. So how can we set up such a combined validator? Well, it's extremely easy if you put the controls that should be checked in combination into a form group. Because, and that's new, a form group also takes a second argument, which is a configuration object. And here you can also register validators. Validators that will now run for the overall form group, because it turns out that a form group is also in the end a form control, just a special kind of control, you could say, that consists of multiple controls. But since that's the case, we can add a new validation function here outside of the component, for example, and I'll name it equal passwords or equal values to make it a bit more generic. And this function, since it will act as a validator function, will receive a control, which will be of type abstract control, just as before. Because such a form group turns out to be of that type, just as the form control objects. And in here, I then want to get my password by accessing control.what. How do I now get hold of my password control? Well, we can't access control.controls.password because TypeScript doesn't know what this abstract control will be. It doesn't know that it will be a form group which has a nested password control inside of it. Now we know that this will be the case, but we can't access it like this. TypeScript doesn't allow that. But thankfully, all those control objects also give us a get method. And this get method takes the name of a control and it will then search for that control. So in this case, password. So that will give me the password control if it exists. Otherwise, get will return null. So it will either give me that control it found or null. But here I know that it should find a value and therefore I'll access that value. But you should add this question mark to, in the end, tell TypeScript and JavaScript that this might be null and that the value property should only be accessed if it's not null. So password therefore will be null if no password control was found. Otherwise, it will be that value that was entered into the password input field. And the confirm password can be retrieved in the same way. Of course, now I want to look for the confirm password control though. And these names here must be the names you chose down there. So now we have the two values. Now we can use them and we can check if password is equal to confirm password. So if they are equal. In that case, at least from this validator's point of view, the values are valid and I'll return null. Otherwise, I'll return such an error object where I'll set passwords not equal to true, for example. And now we can use this equal values validator. We can go down here to the validators of this passwords form group and add the validator like this. Now with that, this form group will be validated. But what's important to understand now is that those validation classes will also be applied to the form group or to the element that's linked to the form group. So in this case, to this div. Therefore, if you save that and you go back and you enter long passwords that are not equal, you don't get any error feedback here. Because if you inspect the DOM, you'll see that Angular did add its classes, but it added them here to this div that groups these controls. That div where I added this form group name directive. And here indeed this is marked as invalid. So our validator seems to work. We just don't have any CSS classes that in the end rely on ngValid being added to the surrounding element. But we can change this by going to the styles CSS file and by editing it. And attached you find an updated version which already has all the changes you need. So you can replace your styles.css code with the one you find attached. If you replace your styles.css file with the attached one, if you go back and you enter long passwords that are not equal, they will be marked as invalid. And only if you enter the same valid password values will that styling go away. And that now, of course, proves that our custom validator works. Now we can actually enhance that validator and make it a bit more generic by actually creating a validator factory here. Because at the moment, of course, this equal values validator looks for exactly a password and a confirm password control. Now what we could do is we could make this equal values function return a function where it's that returned function that receives the abstract control and that then contains this code. But equal values could now take the two control names, control name 1 and control name 2, which should both be of type string, as inputs. And we could then use them here control name 1 and control name 2 in our code. And maybe rename the constants here to val1 and val2, val1 and val2, and the error code to values not equal. With that, we now have a factory function that produces a validator function, but it produces that function based on some input we pass to the factory function. And that allows us to now execute equal values here, just as min-length is a factory function that's executed, to pass our configuration to it. In this case, to pass the two control names to it. And it's then these names that will be used in the produced validator function. With that, if you reload, this will still work as it did before, and valid values that are equal will still be accepted. But now we could theoretically use this equal values validator function to compare any two form controls and not just passwords. So that's something you might want to do if you plan on using that on other controls as well. And that's now it for this section. In this section, you learned a lot about forms, about template-driven and reactive forms. And it therefore was a long section with plenty of information on how you can set up forms in the template or in your code, how you can connect the template to your code, how you can handle form submission, validation, and much more. Now, I will say that there is even more you could do with forms, and you therefore absolutely also might want to check out the official documentation so that you can learn how you can build your own validation directives, how you can build your own form input HTML elements, how you could derive forms dynamically from some data, and how you could create a form object dynamically based on some data. These are all advanced scenarios you're now ready to dive in if you need them for your project because of the very solid foundation we created in this section. To make sure that this section doesn't become a standalone course though, we'll stop here and move on to other important Angular concepts instead. But definitely consider visiting the official documentation to dive even deeper.